Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki, Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started. This is the most important story that you'll see today and for days to come. So listen to this carefully. The Wuhan virus pandemic may have begun in China much before it told the world. As early as May 2019. A new investigation has thrown up some explosive details, and we have the papers tonight for you. These documents, they show that Chinese officials began buying PCR tests worth millions of dollars as early as May 2019, but they told the world about the first cases only in December 2019. So what did they need PCR tests in May for? Did they know there will be an outbreak? Had the outbreak already begun? We don't know, but we have specific tenders, we have dates, we have transaction details, we have locations, we have names of manufacturers, we have very specific inputs that show how the province of Hubei was acquiring PCR tests in very large numbers. And Hubei is the province where the city of Wuhan is located. We've also spoken to the Australian military intelligence officer who has conducted this investigation. He has dug out these details. Like I said, it's the most important story you'll watch today. China's pandemic cover-up is bigger, way bigger than the world initially suspected. And we'll bring you all of those details. Also on the show tonight, Facebook faces outrage over a 6-hour-long global outage. Businesses and communication take a hit as Instagram and WhatsApp go offline. On Gravitas tonight, we ask, will the world finally reconsider over-reliance on this technology giant? In France, an independent inquiry finds that at least 216,000 minors, children, have been sexually abused by the Catholic Church. The report says there are at least 3,200 suspected pedophiles in the French church today. Will America fail to repay its loans? Well, this has never happened before, but it could happen this month. We'll tell you why. And it's 2021 and babies today are being born full of microplastics. How will this affect their health and growth? We'll bring you the findings. We begin as always with Gravitas Global Headlines.
Syukuro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann and Giorgio Parisi have jointly won the 2021 Nobel Prize in Physics for demonstrating how increased levels of carbon dioxide lead to increased surface temperatures and the understanding of physical systems. Moody's has revised India's rating outlook to stable from the negative ranking. The Global Financial Research Agency also affirmed India's foreign currency and local currency long-term issuer ratings at Baa3. The Islamic State has claimed responsibility for a deadly attack near a Kabul mosque, hours after the Taliban said they had destroyed an Islamic State sleeper cell in the Afghan capital. Singapore Parliament has passed a law aimed at preventing foreign interference in domestic politics, which the opposition and activists have criticized as a tool to crush dissent. Romania's 9-month-old minority government has collapsed after losing a no-confidence vote, threatening fresh political instability. Protesters supporting Palestinian prisoners locked up in Israeli jails clashed with Israeli forces near the military checkpoint of Hawara. Tensions have risen after 6 Palestinians escaped a high-security prison in northern Israel last week. According to the largest ever survey on coral health, 14% of the world's coral reefs were wiped out in a decade due to global warming and pollution. Demanding policymakers must take action against climate change. Thousands took to the streets in Milan on the final day of the preparatory meetings for the delegates who will take part in the COP26 summit. The Indian men's and women's hockey teams will not take part in the next year's Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Hockey India has reasoned that there are only 32 days between the CWG Games and the Asian Games, and has given preference to the latter, as it is an Olympic qualifier. They have also cited COVID concerns, and the move comes amid a row between the governments of India and England over quarantine rules for travelers. Bubba Wallace has created history by becoming only the second black driver and the first since Wendell Scott in 1963 to win a race in NASCAR's Elite Cup Series. The 27-year-old won Monday's Yellow Wood 500 at the Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama, having taken the lead with 5 laps to go before the race was stopped due to rain and eventually brought to an end.
Did the Wuhan virus pandemic begin in May 2019? Let me repeat that. May 2019, not December 2019. December was when the first cases came to light in China, but the pandemic could have started in China at least 7 months before that, in the month of May. Why do I say so? Because a new report has thrown up some explosive details. Now, Hubei is the province, where Wuhan city is located. And Hubei was buying PCR tests as early as May 2019. Not a small number, but PCR tests worth millions of dollars. I repeat, in May 2019. And we all know that China announced its first confirmed infections only in December. So why were Chinese officials buying so many PCR tests in the month of May? Did they expect an outbreak a few months later? Did they know of any developments or leaks that could lead to an outbreak? Or were they already containing an outbreak? It's hard to say at the moment. Information in China, is very tough to access, and information on how the pandemic began is well nigh impossible to access. Ask the WHO team or the American intelligence agencies. They all conducted investigations into the origins and came up with virtually nothing. Now, these new findings, the ones that we have for you tonight, could change everything. Could tell you how big the cover-up is. What's the source of this? And how reliable is it? What we are talking about tonight is evidence dug up by an Australian cybersecurity agency. And here's what they found. Details of public procurement bids. Tenders from Chinese agencies in Hubei. And I have copies of those tenders. They have very, very specific details of quantities, of addresses, locations, company names, delivery periods, warranty periods. These tenders were issued from Chinese agencies in Hubei who wanted to buy PCR test kits. And listen to these numbers. During 2019, Hubei spent more than $10 million on PCR tests. In 2018, Hubei spent a little more than $5 million on PCR tests. So the spending nearly doubled from 2018 to 2019. And there was a sudden spike in orders starting May 2019. The question is, what explains this spike? Who was buying these tests? Chinese universities, Chinese military, and the Chinese Center of Disease Control. Does that sound suspicious? It should, because these are all key stakeholders in Hubei. All of them had an alleged role to play in the beginning of the pandemic. Now look at the pattern. Orders from Chinese universities doubled after May 2019. At the Chinese Center for Disease Control, PCR test purchases jumped by 5 times. At animal testing bureaus, the order surged by 10 times. The first major purchase order dates back to 27th of May 2019. And what you see on your screen is a copy of that. Look at who the buyer is. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Airborne Hospital. This is the Chinese military, yes. And they bought something called the fluorescent quantitative PCR instrument. It's basically a piece of equipment that is used for PCR testing. Apparently, the Chinese military did not even have to pay for this. The supplier, in this case it was Sinopharm, the supplier ended up gifting the instrument to the military hospital. Sinopharm also makes Chinese vaccines. Now, I know it's a lot to process, but I'm not done with what we have. There are more revelations. We have more details of other agencies buying PCR tests in China. Let me show you. This is a procurement requirement from 22nd September 2019. It's from the Wuhan Hongshan District Center for Disease Control and Prevention. What were they buying? Pathogen detection equipment. Basically machines to detect pathogens like viruses. And they made 2 such purchases. Another similar tender came out on the 6th of November. This time the buyer is a familiar name, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They also bought tests. The same Wuhan lab that is suspected to be a potential source of the virus, they were buying a fluorescent quantitative PCR instrument, the same equipment that the Chinese military bought in May 2019. And here's something peculiar. For most of us, PCR tests became common only after the pandemic. How many of you knew about a PCR test before the outbreak? They were not mainstream. Although the technology is quite old, the PCR technique was invented way back in the 1980s. And PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's basically a method of testing. And here's how it works. You have a small sample of DNA. A PCR amplifies it. It makes millions of copies of the sequence of this DNA. So the sample becomes large enough to study in detail. That's essentially how a PCR test works. And the technology, like I said, is 3 decades old. But it was not mainstream until the pandemic. In China, though, it was apparently mainstream. All of this evidence shows that China had large numbers of PCR tests well in advance. Why and how is the question. At a time when the world had not even heard of the Wuhan virus, why were Chinese officials buying such a large number of PCR tests? And what do I mean by a large number? Let's look at the trend in China. In 2015, Hubei was issuing 52 contracts for PCR equipment. 52 in a year. In 2016, 53 contracts. 2017, 72 contracts. 2018, 89. And in 2019, see the sudden jump on that graph. 135 contracts were issued. It's a jump of more than 50%. Why did Hubei suddenly need so many PCR machines? I could go on asking these questions. The pattern is very clear and the evidence is strong. Chinese officials were buying PCR tests in suspiciously large numbers well before anyone noticed the Wuhan virus outbreak. And we don't expect China to explain these patterns. Our question tonight is to the global community. What will they do about this new evidence? For how long will they ignore China's cover-up? And their choice is very simple. Staying silent and risking another pandemic, or speaking out and making China pay. And this, as I said, is a major revelation, perhaps one of the most important findings in the Wuhan virus saga. And we couldn't have done this story tonight without repeatedly checking this data and without speaking to the man who led this research effort. His name is David Robinson. He's a retired Australian Army intelligence officer. He co-founded what is called Internet 2.0. It's a company that has published these findings. David Robinson was the lead researcher on this project that shows the Wuhan virus outbreak may have begun in China as early as May 2019, or at the very least, China had begun preparing for an outbreak in May 2019. And tonight, David Robinson joins us from Canberra in Australia. Mr. Robinson, welcome to WION.
Hi, and thank you so much for having me.
Your study, as we've been saying, is extremely significant. Your findings are very important. And this research focuses on how the procurement of PCR tests in Hubei shot up in 2019. Now, for almost 2 years, the world has been trying to answer the question of the origin of the virus without much success. How does your study, how do your findings impact that quest?
Well, it's very hard for us to determine, based off the current commentary and the data and all the investigations, exactly when coronavirus started, because we don't have a patient zero and we don't have key case data. So we've tried to use predictive statistics and third-party data in order to identify potentially when coronavirus might have started emerging. We're looking at people buying PCR equipment because they're potentially dealing with an unknown virus an emerging epidemic in Wuhan, and they're trying to identify cases, what the virus is, and react in a normal way that any health system would react around the world. The key points are, in 2018, most of the PCR equipment was normal hospital and research use. And in 2019, it shifted dramatically to increase. And those drivers, those institutions that drove the growth were from the Centers for Disease Control in Hubei province, significant growth from them, and the Wuhan University of Science and Technology. And key to this university specifically is they have 35 teaching bases and practices in the field. And this is not based off the websites of the other universities. This is not the same level as the other universities. So they've got teaching practices in 22 general hospitals and 10 centers for disease control and prevention. So these are the normal institutions that would be expected to deal with an emerging virus, an unknown virus. And that's where we're seeing the significant increase of purchasing of that equipment from in 2019.
Now, the most important revelation is the fact that the procurements began in May 2019. What are the significant findings from the papers that you have unearthed, and what more can you tell me about this?
So the procurement documents are all open source. They're all available on the internet, and they're all Chinese government assets or organizations purchasing equipment in general. This is all openly available on the internet. The significant increase really occurs in a window between July and October, and that's the bracket. But there was a significant purchase made by one of the CDC units in Hubei province, Wuhan, in May, and also by the People's Liberation Army Hospital. That was announced on the 27th of May for one PCR laboratory piece of equipment.
I'm sure there'll be critics of your report, and this is one of the arguments that they could make, that PCR equipment can be used for other purposes too. PCR equipment has been around for very many years. How do you link these purchases to the Wuhan virus outbreak?
Well, there are significant reasons why to use PCR equipment, but the primary purpose is to amplify DNA in order to identify viruses. So if you want to identify MERS or SARS or swine flu, for example, in both human and agricultural purposes, you're going to use PCR testing. We looked at the data and saw there was a significant correlation in a significant increase in 2020 purchasing and a significant increase in 2019 in Wuhan province. So yes, PCR equipment is used generally, but there is a direct link between the significant increase in PCR equipment and potentially responding to an unknown virus or COVID-19.
Now, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, we know, has already dismissed your study. How do you respond to that?
Well, we've only used Chinese data. We haven't used anyone else's data. We've used their information in order to build our data set and our study. And secondly, more transparency builds trust. And there's been a lot of commentary around the world about the lack of transparency, the lack of ability to access data, the lack of ability to identify a patient zero, and the lack of cooperation in all those international investigations conducted. So we would love to see what the patient zero is. We would love to identify the zoonotic origin of the virus, but I don't think we're actually going to be able to find that just due to the lack of data being presented by China to the world. So all we can do now is use predictive statistics and third-party data points in order to box around the potential answer to all the public's questions, which is a global public, really.
David Robinson, thank you very much for joining us here on WION.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Very, very significant findings that explain the extent of China's virus cover-up. And this is not the only thing that China is up to. China is also pushing its expansionist agenda. We know Taiwan, for one, is preparing for war. It is bracing for an attack, a war it promises to fight till the end. The Air Force in Taiwan is on standby and the country is on alert. SOS calls are being sent out. Allies are being informed. The situation is very, very critical, At least 56 Chinese jets breached Taiwan's airspace on Monday night. 56. This was by far the biggest incursion carried out by China. And it follows 3 days of non-stop show of force by the PLA. Almost 100 jets, Chinese jets, over Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is alarmed at China's actions. But it's not intimidated, it says. The country's president, Tsai Ing-wen, has warned Beijing of quote-unquote catastrophic consequences if an invasion takes place. At the same time, Taiwan's allies have also extended support. They're monitoring China's moves, exploring their options and preparing for any potential strike. Here's a report.
The defense of Taiwan is in our own hands, and we are absolutely committed to that. And if China is going to launch a war against Taiwan, we will fight to the end, and that is our commitment.
This warning was issued on Monday night, shortly after 56 Chinese jets breached Taiwan's airspace. It was the largest show of force on record. A wave of 52 planes, followed by 4 more, flew into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. The first wave was composed of 34 J-16 fighters, 2 Su-30 fighters, 2 Y-9 patrol planes, 2 KJ-500 radar early warning planes, and 12 H-6 bombers. The second wave saw 4 J-16s invade the Taiwanese airspace. This was an extraordinary provocation. It followed a 3-day air power binge that saw 93 PLA planes breach the Taiwanese airspace. That's a total of 142 planes. In just 4 days, China has sent more planes to Taiwan than it does in an entire month. Beijing is certainly up to something. It's not clear what exactly. Taipei doesn't want to take any chances. It has started reinforcing its defenses and has called upon like-minded countries to assist in security cooperation.
During this period of time, we would like to exchange with other countries for security cooperation, and we would like to engage in security or intelligence exchanges with other like-minded partners.
Meanwhile, the Taiwanese Air Force has scrambled its fighter planes. They're monitoring the movement of Chinese warplanes, preparing to repel any potential strike. The country's president, Tsai Ing-wen, has even penned down a warning to China in an essay for the Foreign Affairs magazine she has written. They should remember that if Taiwan were to fall, the consequences would be catastrophic for regional peace and the democratic alliance system. It would signal that in today's global contest of values, authoritarianism has the upper hand over democracy. She added that while Taiwan did not seek confrontation, it would do whatever it takes to defend itself. The question is, can Taiwan defend itself alone? Taipei isn't powerless. It can resist Chinese intimidation, but cannot put an end to it. Taiwan's Air Force possesses around 300 frontline fighters. The Chinese Air Force possesses nearly 2,000. So whenever it wants to, China can easily overwhelm Taiwan. But it sounds easier said than done, because Taiwan's allies are also monitoring Chinese incursions. In fact, they were nearby when the last incursion took place. This includes American Navy aircraft carriers like USS Carl Vinson and USS Ronald Reagan, the British Royal Navy's aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth, and Japanese helicopter carrier JSIC. They're all stationed near Taiwan's southern coast in solidarity with Taiwan. Back in their respective countries, they say their support won't stop.
We urge Beijing to cease its military, diplomatic, and economic pressure and coercion against Taiwan, and we have an abiding interest in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. That's why we will continue to assist Taiwan in maintaining a sufficient self-defense capability.
We will continue to keep a close watch on all related developments. At the same time, instead of simply monitoring the situation, we hope to weigh the various scenarios that may arise, to consider what options we have and the preparations that we must make.
For all their promises, it's unclear how far Taiwan's allies are willing to go. Would they fight back if and when China attacks Taiwan? Only time will tell. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Speaking of time, 6 hours can change a lot. The 4th of October came with an eye-opener. A 6-hour-long outage made the world realize just how dependent we had become on the internet and how the internet has become synonymous with Facebook. Facebook was gone for a good 6 hours, and so were its other apps like WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook Messenger. They were all gone. It was a global outage, one that left the world feeling paralyzed. But all of a sudden, people had no Instagram to scroll through, no Facebook to connect with clients, WhatsApp groups stopped buzzing. And this hit a lot of things. Operations of small businesses, communication, influencer marketing, food delivery systems, live news, basically life as we know it. You know, the one where we mostly live online, on WhatsApp and Instagram stories? That life came to a halt, abruptly. People felt cut off. Some complained on Twitter, some logged into LinkedIn. A few people even embraced the outage and put their time to better use. One internet user said he cleaned his cupboard. Another arranged his plants. What did you do during the outage? Also, why do you think the outage happened in the first place? Facebook has an explanation. It says there were issues with its backbone router. What kind of issues? There was apparently a quote-unquote faulty configuration change. That's what caused the outage. Now, reports say there was mayhem at the Facebook headquarters. Identifying the problem was a task in itself, coordinating the response, an even bigger one. And that's because the outage had brought down Facebook's internal tools too, like the communication platform that its employees use. It was down. Also down were employee access cards. They stopped working. Employees were locked out of their offices. They could not enter conference rooms. Some could not even call or make calls from official cell phones. Some had trouble receiving external emails. I'll tell you what else happened. Facebook servers were down, and its engineers could not enter the server areas to fix the problem. Absolute chaos. How do things like this even happen to a company the size of Facebook? It's an internet giant after all. 3.5 billion people use Facebook services globally. 3.5 billion, half the world's population. Facebook says it wants to bring the world and its people closer. Well, here it is, struggling to secure its own infrastructure, its own servers. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg issued an apology, but for many that did not cut it. That's because this outage has hit incomes. You'll be surprised with the number of small businesses that depend on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp for operation. At least 200 million businesses. And every such outage hits their revenue. In 2019, Facebook and its apps were gone for nearly 14 hours. 2 years later, this has happened again. The tech giant was grilled online from Twitter to Tumblr, Truecaller, Microsoft, Zoom. Everyone joined hands to troll Facebook. Even the Israeli Defense Forces did not miss the opportunity to gloat. This is what they said. If you need any help, the IDF tech support is always ready to lend a hand. KFC Arabia jumped in. They said, order now, our app is working. Brand Facebook was fried in public. Soon its stocks plummeted. Reports say Zuckerberg lost around $6 billion. That's almost $1 billion for every hour of outage. It's quite a pinch. It becomes all the more painful if you recap Facebook's recent misfortunes. They've been through a lot. The company is already suffering in the hands of a whistleblower. Her name is Frances Haugen. She's 37 years old. She worked with Facebook for 2 years. Earlier this evening, she testified before the US Congress. She exposed Facebook's internal working, its dangerous algorithms. secret, lenient rules for elite users. She presented Facebook's internal documents to lawmakers, the media, and American agencies. And this document dump basically reveals that Facebook knew that Instagram was driving some teenagers to suicide, and it did nothing to prevent it. This whistleblower said, and I'm quoting, Facebook, in fact, over and over again chooses profit over safety. Well, that's a lot of bad press. Plus legal and financial troubles for one company, no matter how big. This is a huge problem. And I want to read out a couple of lines from what the Facebook whistleblower told an American publication. This is what she said. The thing I want everyone to know is that Facebook is far, far more dangerous than anyone knows. And it is getting worse. We can't expect it to fix itself on its own. Someone else will have to do it. During the Senate hearing, she said that Facebook exploits children with its addictive tricks, that Facebook will haunt an entire generation. Listen to this.
Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people.
This is Facebook for you, a company worth over $900 billion. It's privy to our personal data. It's a platform whose login ID and password we use for every second app on our cell phones and smart TVs. People are quitting their 9-to-5 jobs to make a living on Instagram. More and more offices are switching to WhatsApp for internal communication. Can they risk another outage? Or should the world rethink its over-reliance on a platform like Facebook? It's a question that we all must try to answer. For now, let's turn to a story from France. An independent inquiry has found that more than 200,000 children were abused by French Catholic clergy in the last 70 years. 200,000. The church failed to prevent these cases. It failed to report them. It failed to bring its clergy to justice. What's worse is that the report says that the church's teachings on the sanctity of priests only created the blind spots needed to allow this kind of sexual abuse. Here's a report.
It happened in his room, which he logged. But the touching took place in the kitchen, in the presbytery.
You no longer know where you live.
These are victims of the French Catholic Church. Marie-Claire Sylvester was abused by a pedophile priest who was also her uncle. Marie-Claire kept the abuse a secret, buried it until 2008.
I don't really remember when it started. I was looking at photos because my dad took a lot of holiday photos. He was a teacher in the Catholic school. He was very religious. That's how it happened. I was turning 6.
There are at least 216,000 others like Marie-Claire, all victims of the French clergy. If you account for those abused by church associates like teachers of Catholic schools, then the total number of victims becomes 330,000. That's how many lives the French Catholic Church has scarred in the last 7 decades. Most of them were boys aged 10 to 13. Jean-Marie was one of them. He is 82 years old now.
I quote from one of the predators, "You should have stopped me. It's not right. It's a sin."
Sin is what the French clergy has committed. The 6th commandment says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." An independent inquiry commission has found that there were at least 3,200 pedophiles in the French Catholic Church. What does the 5th commandment say? "Thou shalt not kill." Many of the church's victims died. 20% of the victims were girls. In fact, those abused by French priests, nuns, and church associates account for 6% of all victims of sexual abuse in France. What happened to the culprits? Just a handful of them received disciplinary action under canonical law. In May 2019, Pope Francis vowed to address abuse by priests. The French Catholic Church commissioned an inquiry. Heading it was Jean-Marc Sauve. A retired French civil servant. His team spent 2.5 years going through records at courts, police stations, and the church.
The abuse committed by clerics primarily concerns male children, young boys who represent nearly 80% of the victims.
Shortly after taking up the job, Sauve received a letter. It was from a former boarding school classmate. The classmate recounted abuse by a priest who gave music lessons to both him and Sauve. The priest had also gone on to abuse dozens of other boys. Sauve's commission discovered that the abuser had suddenly left the boarding school. It also found that 2.5% of French clergy had sexually abused minors since 1950. This was a systemic abuse, one that the Roman Catholic Church was burying under a veil of silence. Eric Boone was the first victim the commission heard. Boone is 49 years old. He was sexually abused by a Dominican friar. Boone was a young teenager then. Today, he is demanding a reform of the clergy.
There were monastic reforms in the 11th century, and as there was the Protestant reform in the 16th century. Today there is a reform of the church to be lived, that is to say, a return to the sources.
The inquiry report says the church's teaching on sexuality, the sanctity of the priesthood, created the blind spots, ones that allowed for sexual abuse. What's more, the church was indifferent to these abuses until the 2000s. Does the church have anything to say in its defense?
My desire on this day is to ask you for forgiveness to each and every one.
Reform helps. Regret, not so much. That's our advice, just in case the Vatican happens to be making notes. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Here's a question. What happens if you don't pay interest on your loan? Well, your bank may call you up. They may give you a deadline. Pay up or face legal action, that's what they'll tell you. But what happens if the world's largest economy misses payments? We don't know. But we could find out this month. I'll tell you what this means. But first, some basic economics. Most countries spend more money than they earn. And the US is no exception. It's the world's biggest economy. It spends more than it earns. Countries borrow money to finance their expenses. And this is not a problem in India or in most of Europe because there is no debt ceiling, no legal limit on how much the government can borrow. But that's not the case in America. In America, the US Congress decides how much the government can borrow. Right now, that limit is $28.4 trillion. That's a lot of money, yes, almost 10 times India's economy. But America has already reached that level of debt, $28.4 trillion. If it wants to spend more, it must borrow. And to borrow, it must get the American Parliament on board. They call it the US Congress. Now, Republicans in the US Congress are not on board. They have the option to raise the debt ceiling or to suspend it, but they won't because it's a politically unpopular move. So they'll not do it because midterm elections are due in 2022 and Republicans do not want to be seen as adding to public debt. What about Democrats? They have a majority in Congress and they have a president in the White House. But to raise the debt ceiling, you need 60 votes in the Senate, not 51. Which means 10 Republicans must join in for this thing to pass. And that's not happening. The Republicans are not lending that support. The other option they have is a special parliamentary strategy. It's called budget reconciliation. Now, this procedure does not need a special majority in Congress. Democrats are using it to push Joe Biden's multi-trillion-dollar spending plan. So here's what the Republicans propose. Put the debt ceiling clause in the same bill. And you don't need our support to pass it. The problem is that bill is far from ready. It cannot happen immediately. Biden's own party members consider it too lavish. It's the classic definition of a deadlock. Neither side wants to give in. The result is an unprecedented crisis in the US. America could run out of money by the 18th of October, the 18th of this month. It could default on debt payments. What does that mean for the global economy? Frankly, nobody knows. As I said, this has never happened before. America has never failed to repay its loans, but it may now. On Monday, President Joe Biden gave a grim account of what to expect.
This is going to undermine the safety of U.S. Treasury securities, and it will threaten the reserve status of the dollar as the world's currency that the world relies on. American credit rating will be downgraded. Interest rates will rise for mortgages, auto loans, credit cards, borrowing. In the days ahead, even before the default date, people may see the value of their retirement accounts shrink. They may see interest rates go up, which will ultimately raise their mortgage payments and car payments. And the American people, look, I just say it this way. As soon as this week, your savings in your pocketbook could be directly impacted by this Republican stunt. It's as simple as that.
Millions of Americans could lose Social Security and Medicare. U.S. soldiers may not get their salaries. Food assistance will stop. Pension payments would lapse. And nearly 6 million Americans could lose their jobs. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has predicted a recession. And as we know, American recessions cause global slowdowns. Joe Biden blames the Republicans for this deadlock, and to some extent he's right. During the Trump presidency, the Democrats did vote to increase the debt ceiling. A quarter of the total debt was racked by President Trump. But as Biden himself keeps saying, the buck stops with him now. He talks about bipartisanship. He talks about reaching out across the aisle. Well, now is a good time to do that. America is on the brink of exporting a completely avoidable recession to the world. Blaming the opposition is not going to cut it. President Biden will have to take responsibility. On his watch, America's global standing has taken a hit again. For decades, U.S. securities have been considered the safest asset on earth. Same with the U.S. dollar, a safe bet always. But today that image is at risk. If the U.S. wants to anchor the world economy, it must reform. Public debt cannot be held hostage to party politics. Recessions cannot be dangled as leverage. So Biden's task is long-term reform, possibly to abolish the debt ceiling or to create a more stable approach to settling it. Because right now, the so-called stable presidency seems full of uncertainties. We'll be watching this story for you. And a headline now that should worry every parent on this planet. Frankly, the whole world. Even if you're not a parent, you must watch this. Babies are full of microplastics. This is the headline. And I know you have many questions. What are microplastics? How do they get inside babies? Why are babies full of them? And what effect does it have? We'll try to answer them one by one. First of all, what are microplastics? They're basically tiny particles of plastic, less than 5 millimeters in size, which means you cannot see them, not with your naked eyes. How are microplastics produced? They break away from bigger pieces of plastic. It's as simple as that. Like bottles, clothes, industrial products. Most things we use are made of plastic, and they inevitably produce microplastic. It's all pervasive. Question number 2, how do they get inside babies? Well, simply put, they eat them, they consume them. We are talking about plastic toys, plastic spoons, chewing dummies, even the carpets on your floor. Babies are always busy chewing something or the other. Well, turns out they're ingesting microplastics in the process. What quantities are we talking about? Researchers in New York compared stool samples from infants and adults. Do you know what they found? Infants had 10 to 20 times more microplastics in their stool, 10 to 20 times more. Even newborns have microplastics inside them. How does that happen? Newborns are not playing with toys, they're not chewing carpets. So how do they have microplastics inside them? Apparently, microplastics can be transferred from mother to baby. That's how easily this thing travels. Question number 3, what are the health effects? And this is where things get interesting and tricky. Experts agree that microplastics are a health problem. But to what extent? That they don't know. An average adult usually ingests around 5 grams of microplastic per week. Some of it passes through the system, some of it accumulates within the organs. Research has shown that microplastics can actually pass through cells, which means they can enter the bloodstream. Unfortunately, this is where the research ends. We don't know what happens next. Some studies have been conducted on animals and they have shown inflammation, cell shutdown, metabolic issues. These are all serious side effects. They must be investigated and studied in detail. Until then, here's what you can do. Buy wisely. Every child wants the best of toys, but more toys means more microplastics. Keep that in mind. Also, avoid plastic wrappers and containers wherever possible. Vacuum your floor regularly. Keep an eye on your child's chewing habits. And most importantly, do not prepare hot formula in a plastic bottle. It may sound silly, but it's a strict no. Researchers say plastic bottles could dose babies with 1 billion microplastic particles per year. 1 billion. I know these instructions are difficult to follow, but consider the alternative. Exposing your child to something whose health risks are still unknown. The fact is, you can never get rid of microplastics. They have penetrated every aspect of our lives. What we can hope for, though, is to limit the impact, to use alternatives wherever possible, and to ration consumption until we have more clarity on the health effects. Think about it. We'll wrap the show, leaving you as always with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.